Welcome to Module 3 of our learning session. This module focuses on the impacts of systemic discrimination. If you haven't watched Module 1 and Module 2, we encourage you to do so now. Module 1 provides an introduction to BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, offers an overview of the entire session, and explains how to use the different components of this web-based learning session. Module 2 answers the question, what is systemic discrimination? During this module, we'll ask you to pause and reflect at different times. So consider having a pen and paper available to write down your thoughts if you find that helpful. Let's take a moment to review what we've learned so far. In Module 1 and 2, we've learned to identify the key elements of systemic discrimination and explain the differences and relationship between systemic and interpersonal discrimination. In this module, we'll become familiar with the nature and extent of the impacts of systemic discrimination, and we'll identify who is impacted by systemic discrimination and where it appears.
Take a minute to reflect on the examples of systemic discrimination that were shared in Module 2 and think about the three types of impacts we identified. We'll look at each type of impact more closely through the stories of people who were impacted. What types of impacts did you notice in the previous examples of systemic discrimination? Feel free to pause the recording while you reflect. So the examples that we will share today are direct quotes from people describing how systemic discrimination impacted them. They're powerful, so we want to share a bit about the content. This includes impacts of systemic discrimination on Indigenous peoples in healthcare and in policing, and the impacts of gender-based systemic discrimination and sexual harassment in policing. Okay, let's look at the first type of impact. One type of impact is creating barriers. Barriers that limit or prevent the participation of specific groups or groups of people based on their identity. This example is from Pamela Beebe, an Indigenous rights activist. She recounts her experience with barriers to accessing healthcare. Here's what Pamela had to say. When somebody has to go to the emergency room and get sent home right away, nobody is surprised in my family. We get asked immediately, are you on drugs? Are you high? Why are your eyes red? All the questions that are just not appropriate. Rather than, what's going on? And what do you need help with? Now, systemic discrimination can have more than one type of impact. And this example also shows the impact of, or potential harms, to Pamela Beebe's health. Okay, we'll look at another example. A second impact of systemic discrimination is causing higher levels of harm to a specific group or groups of people. This example is from Pam Palmader, attorney and Mi'kmaq woman from Eel River Bar First Nation. Here's what Pamela had to say. Who's the first to show up when we're peacefully defending our land rights or water rights? It's probably going to be the RCMP. And they're not going to look like the RCMP riding around on their red coats and horses. They're going to look like the military, heavily armed vehicles, snipers, camouflage, fatigues, you name it. That's how they relate to Indigenous peoples, even today. When I had my own sons, who are grown now, from the time they were teenagers onward, I was like, please, it doesn't matter what your human rights are. It doesn't matter what your civil charter rights and freedoms are. Please, if you ever get stopped by a police officer, whatever you do, don't say anything. don't cause any problems because I can't get you back if they've already shot you. Systemic discrimination can also reinforce existing disadvantages, which is a third impact. We've already seen women experience disadvantages in terms of salaries compared to men. This example shows how additional forms of systemic discrimination worsen that disadvantage. And the example comes from a National Observer news story. Merlot's voice cracks as she speaks about her 20 years on the force. When she got pregnant with her first child, she was told she needed to choose between having kids or working for the RCMP. Next time she should keep her legs closed, she was told. When another officer cut his thumb on a handcuff, he put it in his pants pocket and asked her to kiss it better. Once, when a dildo was seized as evidence, she was accused of taking it home overnight. No matter what you did or said, it was turned around to be something sexual. And Merlot said, I did cry a little bit today, but it's only in the past couple of years that I could talk about it without just being a wreck. It takes a long time to heal from it. Now, this example also illustrates the multiple impacts of creating barriers and causing harm.
Think back to the previous examples of systemic discrimination that have been shared, and take a minute to reflect on the following question. Does systemic discrimination impact only the people who are directly targeted? First, let's clarify the question with the example of Janet Merlot's story. In that story, women are specifically targeted by the RCMP's behavior. But do you think that only women are impacted by it? The answer to the question is no. Systemic discrimination has the largest impacts on the groups that are directly targeted, but it does impact all of us, all of society. And we'll look at how this occurs over the next few slides. But first, take a minute to think back on the examples shared earlier and reflect on the question. How does systemic discrimination impact all members of society, including those not directly targeted? It's important to remember that the negative impacts on targeted groups are reason enough to address systemic discrimination. But understanding the impacts that systemic discrimination has on all of society can provide additional reasons to advocate for addressing systemic discrimination. Considering these impacts in no way diminishes the importance of the negative impact systemic discrimination has on targeted groups. There are three different impacts that systemic discrimination can have on society as a whole. For example, systemic discrimination limits a diversity of ideas and views. By creating barriers to specific groups, systemic discrimination can limit the diversity of ideas and views shared within a given setting. And the failure to include those ideas and viewpoints means that some very innovative possibilities may never be considered. If we look at Janet Merlot's story, for example, systemic discrimination against women in policing may lead many women to not become police officers in the first place or to leave the system early. And that results in a loss of the many ideas and viewpoints and skills that these women could contribute to policing in Canada. Next, systemic discrimination prevents systems from functioning well. So, systemic discrimination can lead to a rightful distrust of a system by those who are impacted directly. And that can result in those people not accessing or using the system. And that means that those delivering the service are unable to provide them to everyone who needs them. For example, the hospital from Pamela Beebe's story can't support Indigenous people's health effectively because of systemic discrimination. Next, systemic discrimination produces additional costs to society. Both limiting the diversity of ideas and views and preventing systems from functioning well can lead to additional costs to society. For example, if Indigenous people don't seek out healthcare in early stages of an illness due to systemic discrimination, their condition may become more severe, which has a palpable human cost and also may lead to higher healthcare costs. I'd invite you now to reflect on these three questions. Think about the previous examples of systemic discrimination shared in this session and ask, what groups were impacted? Where were they impacted? And why do we call it systemic discrimination? British Columbia's Human Rights Code is a law that protects people from both systemic and interpersonal discrimination. Let's take a look at the code now and see how it applies to the question that we've asked you to reflect on. So that first question, where were they impacted? Well, the code prohibits systemic and interpersonal discrimination in certain areas shown on the slide, in the corners and at the bottom. These include employment, housing, services, publications, and membership in unions and associations. Let's take a look at that next question. Why do we call it systemic discrimination? When we talk about systems in systemic discrimination, we're referring to the laws, the policies, the practices, and the ways of doing things in the different areas of everyday life that we interact with. Now, some of these systems are broad and can include many different locations. For example, services can include healthcare, policing, or the social welfare system. And some of these systems are more localized, such as the systems and processes in our workplace or in our faith based setting. If we look at the next question, which groups are impacted, we've already seen that systemic discrimination occurs when a specific group or groups are negatively impacted by policies, laws, practices, or general attitudes and behaviors. Some examples shared in this session include Indigenous people, women, people with disabilities, and Muslim people in Canada. It's illegal under the code to discriminate against people based on the protected identities presented in the circle in the slide. Some examples here are discrimination based on age, sex, race, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Your handout contains information about the protected characteristics and the areas on this slide. It's important to note that some characteristics are only protected in certain areas, and we've included a table that discusses that in the handout package. It's important to note that systemic discrimination can occur in areas that are not included on this slide and against additional groups, and these impacts can be equally harmful. Addressing policies, practices, and behaviors within systems and impacting groups that are not protected by the code is equally important. And part of this policy change includes the work of BCOHRC and other organizations to add additional protected characteristics to the code. For example, Indigenous identity was recently added to the code, and BCOHRC and others continue to advocate for the addition of social condition, an identity which could include factors such as poverty, lack of housing, or adequate education. You can learn more about your rights and responsibilities under the Human Rights Code by joining a BCOHRC webinar. Sessions are posted regularly on our website events page.
We've come to the end of Module 3. The next module looks at the topic of noticing systemic discrimination. Before proceeding to Module 4, we invite you to download the PDF of the presentation and the handout for Module 3. The handout contains information on the personal characteristics that are protected under BC's Human Rights Code. Thank you for participating in Module 3 of Introduction to Systemic Discrimination.